Welcome to this episode of the Smart Leader Sell podcast. I'm Jessica Lorimer, sales coach and leadership expert, and today I'm joined by one of the coolest people on the internet. Today we are talking to the lovely Rob Walch, who is joining us after a trip and making time in his busy schedule over from Libsyn to have a chat about podcasting and what podcasting really means for sales and scaling your business. Welcome, Rob.
Jessica, thanks for having me on.
I'm very excited about this. I'm very excited to kind of chat more about podcasting because, as you know, I've had my podcast for a year now. I feel like I should have bought it a birthday cake, but didn't. And it was a really new thing for me. Podcasting was really new, even though I've been in the online space for 4 years and I've listened to podcasts. I didn't set one up for a long time. And I guess that's something that I hear quite a lot from people. A lot of people listen to podcasts, but they don't necessarily get them set up straight away.
You know, the number one reason I hear from people for not starting a podcast is they don't like the sound of their voice. I hear that all the time. Like, oh, you should podcast. Like, I blog. I'm like, you should podcast. So I don't like the sound of my voice. So I always do this analogy. I go, when you pick up the phone and you call someone, I go, does the person on the other end scream in horror? Does their head explode? I go, if not, you probably have an okay voice. Even Gilbert Gottfried has a podcast. So anybody can have a podcast. Don't worry about your voice.
I love this. I absolutely love that. And it's so funny because I remember I think it's like the second or third episode of my podcast where I said, I made the mistake of listening back to an episode once we'd hit publish. And I genuinely felt like I sounded like Minnie Mouse on crack. And that was a real disturbing kind of point for me.
Yeah, I mean, technically, there's the reason why when you hear your voice back, it's not as rich as it sounds to yourself. And I don't want to get into it's all real boring stuff. But the point of it is nobody thinks their voice sounds great. So don't worry about it. I mean, even probably James Earl Jones probably heard outtakes from Star Wars and goes, oh, I don't like my voice.
I love it.
Don't worry about it. That should never, ever be your excuse. Because if you're comfortable talking with people on the phone, then you're actually okay with your voice. I mean, if you don't want to actually talk to people on the phone, then I'll give you that.
You might have bigger problems.
Right. But if you haven't had that issue, if you haven't if you haven't avoided calling people in the last 10 years, you're probably okay to podcast.
So let's talk a little bit about you and how you got into podcasting, because obviously people who are listening may not know, but you are the genius behind Libsyn.
Well, I didn't start Libsyn. So Libsyn was started by 4 other guys. So I've been podcasting since 2004, and I was an early user of Libsyn. Mm-hmm. But I've been with Libsyn for over 11 years. So I don't want to take the credit. There's a lot of technical people that I'll give the genius credit to. I just happen to be more of the marketing side of Libsyn.
Which takes a lot. You know, it takes a lot to market a platform, because I don't know you might be more technical than I am, but I started my career in technology recruitment, and trying to sell technology to people who weren't technically minded is actually a really tough gig, because people feel like technology is dry, and even though we all want the end results that the tech ultimately can give us, it can be a really hard sell.
And there's a lot more steps in podcasting. So I give this equation of 5-1-5, which stands for 5 minutes to blog something, an hour long to create that as an audio podcast, and 5 hours if you want to make that into a video podcast of the same content. Mm-hmm. It's a lot more work to do the audio podcast than it is a blog. But there's also 600 million bloggers versus less than 500,000, really less than 200,000 active podcasters. So there's a huge discrepancy between bloggers and podcasters and the numbers that are out there.
Do you think that that's purely because of the effort that goes into creating a podcast and the technical kind of know-how behind it? Or do you think that it's just that podcasting is almost still in its, not early adopter phase, but in its adoptive phase of people figuring out how to use it for themselves and make money from it?
I think it has to do with there's a lot of steps involved in podcasting. So I think that scares off some people. It's a little bit more intensive than just, going to a website and typing in some characters that you've always done and filling in a form and hitting publish. You actually have to record something. You have to get it up there. So there's a little bit of the barrier to entry from that perspective that's a little bit more difficult. Again, I do believe it has a lot to do with people not as comfortable about their voice. They're not sure what they want to say. And then there are some people that they want to put the cart well before the horse.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. I mean, I'll get people email me all the time like, I'm ready to podcast. I'm ready to monetize my podcast. And I'll go and look, and the best episode ever has had less than 10 downloads.
Okay.
Monetize at that level. It's not going to happen.
So let's talk about that, actually, because that's a really interesting one. When I came into the world of podcasters, it's a really discerning crowd. Okay. And I say that my poddies, like as I call them, the listeners of my show, are probably the most discerning people when it comes to my content. And they give great feedback. They're really good at telling me, yeah, Jess, we really liked this episode, but this one sucked, which is also really useful. But actually, the world of podcasters, when I started thinking about building my podcast, everyone was like, oh, why would you want to monetize your podcast? You should just be doing it as a hobby. And it was really, it took me a while to find other people who were running podcasts as part of their business and that were okay with the monetization outside of things like sponsorships and, things like that. So is there a particular reason behind that? Or is it, is it just because people get lower downloads and it takes a longer time to build that they check the monetization piece?
The people that can actually monetize directly from their show, it's a small percentage, 6-7% of the shows out there actually ever get to the numbers that you really need to monetize directly. And when I say directly from your show, that really comes down to two core ways to monetize directly. One is advertising, getting sponsorship on your show. And then the other one is donation, where people donate, pay for premium, something like that. So those are the direct monetizations where either advertisers are paying you for your audience or your audience is paying you for not having advertisers, basically. One of the two, or some combination. A lot of people do a combination thereof. So make some content free and some content premium. The percentage of people that can do that, direct monetization, either of those methods, it really is small. And the people that do make money, though, from podcasts is larger than that because they make it from other ways. They make it from building a brand, getting a job, promoting their company. One of a great example of someone who grew his company from podcasting is John Jantz at Duct Tape Marketing. If you look at what he's done with his podcast, he went out and interviewed the people that he thought would be good clients. So now he got a relationship with those clients, and those clients, those interviewees turned in, actually, to a certain percentage of them, turned into clients, a lot greater percentage than the cold call emails that he might have sent out. So, what I said to folks is, one of the great ways you can monetize from a podcast is figure out who your potential clients are and then create a podcast around your genre or that topic that your clients would be in, and then send an email to them saying, I think you're brilliant and I think you should share your brilliance with my audience, and stroke their ego. It's a lot more likely to get a reply email than saying, hey, I've got a service and I think you should pay for it. Right? So which one are people more likely going to reply to? The one where someone said they were a genius, or the one that said, hey, I want your money?
And it's an interesting thing, isn't it? Because actually podcasting helps you, I think, build better relationships. Even if you're interviewing people, and it's interesting you mentioned interviewing people from that perspective of maybe gaining them as clients, but also I think one of the big things that I've seen in the podcasting world, and actually in the online entrepreneurship space as a whole, is this idea of leverage and building audiences. And it's actually much easier to get somebody onto your podcast and leverage their audience and grow your own by appearing on their podcast or having them on yours and getting them to share it on social media than it is simply to go out there from that perspective of, hey, I want this, and it would be great if you could just send a newsletter to your list and tell them who I am. That would be awesome. People don't do that, whereas they are much happier to come onto a podcast. They're happier to share a story. They're happy to do interesting interviews, and they'll go ahead and they'll share that, and you can win off of the back of those kinds of things.
And it's a lot easier to get guests as an audio interviewee than it is to ask them to do a guest post or something like that. It takes a lot of time for that person to create up a post and edit and relook at that. Whereas if you as a podcaster reach out to them like we're doing right now, and it's just a matter of going to the Zoom link and I show up and I talk and you take care of all the hard work. And I'm like, oh, thank you, Jessica. I'll be happy to come on your show.
Exactly. And from the podcasting perspective, I can sit here in my PJs. I've just, come back from the gym and I'm like, right, I'm going to talk for 30 minutes or so. And then actually my day is pretty much done. And it makes, for me, podcasting really opened my eyes to this work smarter, not harder piece in my business, because actually it did everything that video for me didn't. You know, I don't have to dress up. I don't have to put makeup on. I don't have to brush my hair if I don't want to. I can sit, I can batch record a ton of them without having to run and change my t-shirt every 5 minutes or put a hat on or any of those kind of gigs. And equally, it's not like blogging. It's interesting. You can get interesting guests on. You can have, I think, completely different discussions. So for me, this world of podcasting did everything that the other platforms just couldn't for me. They couldn't be convenient. They couldn't produce the same sort of conversations. I found that on video, people were much more worried about how they looked than the quality of the interview that they were going to give, for example. And so for me, podcasting's made this huge difference.
And it's a lot easier to edit audio.
Yes.
To make it sound better than it is to edit video. And then a really important point is there's a lot more time in the day for your potential audience to listen to a podcast than there is for them to watch a video. So they can listen while they're commuting to and from work, walking the dog, working out, doing yard work, whatever it is, you're just working. People listen to podcasts at work. You can't watch videos at work. Your boss walks around the corner and you're watching a YouTube video. Their next call is to HR. The boss walks around the corner and you're listening to a podcast. They think, oh, good employee. They're being quiet.
Which is, of course, what you want from an employee, to be quiet.
Get their job done, right? But that's the beauty of podcasting. There's more time in the day to consume audio podcasts than there is any other form of medium. So
how can people build successful podcasts? Because you've talked about numbers, and I know this is such a broad question, so I'm going to kind of specify, I guess, for my audience. So if we look at the majority of my podcast listeners who say to me, Jess, I want to start a podcast, and the first thing I say is, it's going to take you a while to grow your audience base, because it took me a year. You know, it has taken a year of consistent 2 episodes a week, making sure that I go out and promote it, making sure that I run special things on the podcast to up the listenership and stuff. But as the basics go, you know, what do people really need to focus on, the top 2 or 3 things in order to start building a podcast that is successful, gets them more listeners, and that helps them build this kind of community?
Well, you kind of hit on all the points there and what you just said. One is you need to be consistent and release content on a regular basis so that your audience has an expectation of when the content's coming out. You need to have a community. You need to involve your audience and get them involved in it. Because at the end of the day, the shows that grow, the ones that really grow the biggest, it's about word of mouth. It's about the listeners telling their friends, you need to check this out. Now, you have to kickstart it as a podcaster. And that's the hard part, is how do you kickstart it? And there are some ways you can do that. Again, as we mentioned, being consistent so that there's an expectation, you're doing some promotion, and then you have to look at, are you going to advertise? Overcast is a good place where you can advertise a podcast. You can look at Spotify to advertise. You can look at other podcasts in your genre to advertise, or network with those other podcasts that are in your genre, being a guest on their show, having them a guest on your show, finding influential bloggers in your space and bringing them on your show as a guest. And then editing those interviews to make those bloggers sound good. Because a lot of people that aren't used to talking will do a lot of ums, uhs, you knows. And if they listen to their interview on your show and they sound like an idiot in their mind, they're not going to promote that interview. I think a lot of people do a lot of record, stop, post, never edit, never take it out, never clean it up, never make the guest sound good. And if they don't make the guest sound good, the guest is not going to promote it to their peeps.
No, of course. And also you've got to have a good experience. I think you've got to give the guest something that is valuable to them. You know, whenever I run interviews, for example, I always say to people, I want you actively to tell my listeners where they can find you. Why should they bother finding you? Because actually, ultimately, that's one of the biggest pieces of leverage that they can get from me is to leverage my audience. And equally, it gives my audience something really valuable, and that they're being exposed to people who genuinely are useful to the growth of their business. And I think that's really important. It's then a mutually beneficial exchange.
Well, one thing too, don't forget, is how you follow up with your guest after the interview. I've been on multiple podcasts as guests, and I've seen the gamut where people have sent me basically sample tweets, URLs, embed code, everything from the interview, making it my life easy. If I want to promote it, no matter how I promote it, I just copy and paste and I'm done. And then I've had other people that will follow up and they go, oh, by the way, our interview went up 4 weeks ago. I forgot to tell you. And that's it. No link, nothing.
And that doesn't help.
Yeah. And that's like, okay, it went up 4 weeks ago. You should have told me it was going up. They didn't know when it was going to go up originally. And now they're following up and they're not giving me any information. Well, I'm not going to go search where it was.
No.
And if you don't give me the URL, I'm not going to go promote it in social media. But if you're the person that sent me everything I needed to promote it in social media, sure. Some people have sent me samples. Like you could either use this copy to paste into social media or this one or this one. They give me like 3 or 4 different examples of code, that's custom made for the interview that we did. And I'm like, oh, wow, copy paste. I can do that. So
it does make life easy.
They made my life easy. Guess what? They got heavier promotion. The guy that said, hey, it happened 4 weeks ago, he got no promotion. I wasn't going to go search it down.
I really like that. And I also like what you said there about kickstarting, because that is the thing I think I see the most of. And actually, I was really fortunate that when I set up my podcast, the podcast producer that we use said, look, don't go hell for leather just trying to get into iTunes new and noteworthy. Aim for the top 100 instead in your category, and that's going to be far more valuable. And so we did that. And I did see the uptake in traffic when we did that and things. But I think there's this kind of popular notion that actually you just need to hit new and noteworthy in iTunes and that's going to kickstart it. And then suddenly the podcast will skyrocket from there. But is that really true?
Here's a good, easy advice for you. If you're looking for a podcast consultant and they focus on new and noteworthy, run away, run away, run away. They tell you need to launch with 10 episodes. Run away, run away, run away. I've seen some of the most successful podcasts launch with 1 episode. The minimum number is 1. The maximum number you need to launch with is 1. You don't need to launch with 3, 5, 10. Launch with 1. Release from that point on a consistent basis. And do not worry about new and noteworthy. It's so overrated. In the subcategories, it's irrelevant. You can't game it anymore. And in the main category, it's all about Apple handpicking you. So there's nothing you can really do to influence it in any way that's going to have any real value or benefit for you. Ratings and reviews don't really have any real bearing on your show. It's the number of new subscribers, getting people to go to iTunes, your peeps. If you have followers outside of podcasting in social media, you need to drive them to Apple Podcasts to click subscribe. That's what Apple wants. That helps drive your show up.
And so that makes a valuable point, doesn't it? I mean, around certainly whether or not it's best to set up a podcast if you already have an audience, because that may help you become more successful initially because you'll have immediate traffic that you can drive there, or whether you build a business like John Jantsch has, like John Lee Dumas did, around the podcast itself and build your audience specifically from this community.
Yeah, and that really comes down to whether you have it. If you have people tell me, oh, I got a mailing list. And I'm like, are they your people or did you buy the mailing list? Buying a mailing list is no, you don't have a mailing list. You have a list of people. If you actually have a native mailing list of people who know who you are, that is of value in podcasting. And you can send out a bulk email to your actual peeps saying, hey, I've launched this podcast. Please go into iTunes on Monday, or you send it out on Monday and say, hey, we're going to launch. Actually, Thursday is the best day to launch if you really want to launch a podcast.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, the reason you want to go on Thursday if you want to do an email push is Apple updates on Mondays. And the rankings in the top 100 in the different categories are based on the number of new subscribers in the last 7 days with a weighted average for the last 24, 48, 72 hours. So if you get 72 hours away from Monday, and you do a promotion, a push, getting the same number of subscribers on a Thursday and Friday will have more bearing in the top 100 than would be on a Monday or Tuesday.
That's so cool. See, guys, you get all the sneak peeks here. That's amazing. I didn't realize that at all.
Yeah, one person that's really good out there that's helped a lot of folks do these top 100 pushes is Paul Culligan. And Paul lets me know ahead of time when he's going to have one of his clients do a push to the 100. And we watch and we'll see. And we've seen that the later in the week is better for pushes.
That's fantastic.
And again, when they have a native mailing list, that it's their followers those people have done really well and push up. It doesn't take many subscribers to push into the top 100 overall. You'd be surprised how a few hundred people clicking the subscribe button in one day will move you into the top 100 overall.
That's amazing, isn't it? I mean, we did earlier this year in the summer, we did a Sales in for Summer challenge. So if you're one of the poddies who took part in that, you'll know that we had a two-pronged approach and we did a debrief around it where we explained why we were making the push to the top 100. And what ended up happening was that we did hit that top 50 spot. And that was really, really awesome because it was something that we were doing a year after we launched the podcast. We hadn't ever expected to get into New and Noteworthy, but we really wanted to see what would happen if we hit that top 100. And what that did was it ended up gaining us initially in the month of July over 800 new subscribers. And we actually retained, which is, I think, more important, over 600 of those. So it was a really good percentage of new people that found us, but also people that continued listening. So I guess another thanks for that. If you found us in July and you're still listening, we appreciate you.
Now, there is one thing you don't ever want to do.
Oh.
And that is hire any of these companies that say they guarantee you placement in iTunes. There are people out there in Fiverr and other places that will guarantee you placement in the top 100 lists. Mm-hmm. These folks do it in what Apple would consider not legitimate ways.
Okay.
And if Apple decides that it's not legitimate, in other words, they're out there with Malaysian click farms where people are clicking on computers and just subscribing and unsubscribing and changing Apple IDs, Apple will boot your show from iTunes and it will not come back. So you have to watch out. There are people that are actively promoting services that will claim to promote your podcast, move it up in the top 100. And there was one service out there charging $5,000 a month for this. So a lot more than Fiverr, who was a 5K-er. And people were paying that. We're paying $5,000 a month for this. And it was basically a Malaysian, click farm. And they would just drive in fake subscribers into iTunes. And Apple knows this. It's pretty easy for Apple to see who it is. And Apple has been booting shows out. So be careful, folks. If someone approaches you and says, oh, I guarantee you top placement in iTunes, run away, because that is an easy way to kill your show.
And this is the thing, isn't it? Because we often talk about vanity metrics and the reasoning behind why you should or shouldn't do something and whether or not it's going to really increase your sales or build your audience. And I think it's so interesting that people have kind of cottoned onto this idea of, right, okay, well, we'll get you into the top 100 or the top 10 or whatever on iTunes, and that people are paying for it. And it is a vanity metric to a certain degree. I mean, yes, we did get admittedly 800 new listeners, but the reality was, could I have spent money on Overcast or advertising on Facebook or something like that and got the same reality? Quite possibly.
Well, yeah, here's the thing. What you said earlier was you said you got an increase and then they stayed. That's key because that's real listeners, right? And you didn't game it and you didn't go out and do anything. You reached out to your peeps and did that the right way. But there are other people out there that have done it the wrong way and you want to stay away from that. Going to Overcast and advertising actually is a pretty good way because you'll find real podcast listeners in Overcast. Right? People that are using the Overcast app are power podcast users. And so anytime that someone clicks subscribe in that. Now, people clicking subscribe in Overcast has no bearing at all to your rankings in iTunes. So that won't affect you one way or the other. It's actually growing your audience. And I am of the belief set that you want to grow your audience everywhere, not just Apple Podcasts and iTunes, but everywhere. Eventually, they're going to come back and they're going to use the application that they're most familiar with and most comfortable with and the one that does the best job. And that's up to the folks at Apple and others to make their application that application. But you want to make sure your show is everywhere. So when someone tells their friend about your show, it's available. And then where you go to promote your show, really, there's only 8 places where people consume podcasts that get more than 1% of podcast consumption. And Overcast is number 3, Spotify is number 2, Apple Podcast, iTunes is number 1. And you also have Castbox and Stitcher and Pocket Cast, Podcast Addict, and Google Podcasts. And that's it. Those are your top 8 for podcast consumption.
And that's not a lot, is it? Because the stat you were talking about earlier with the 600 million bloggers or something?
Yeah.
Like that. When you look at blogs, there are so many different ones out there. And it's literally a case of pick a website and you have to peruse each one individually. Whereas when you're talking about podcasts, to have only 8 major platforms is huge, because each platform has a loyal subscriber base of its own. And each platform therefore can guarantee you those new listeners that you're looking for. So it's a case of really being selective, I'd imagine, about where you actually put the podcast out.
Well, I would say not being even selective, being shotgun approach, get it everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
I believe get your podcast, any place that has audio podcasts. Those 8 are the key ones. And of those 8, you really only have to submit to 3. You only have to submit to Stitcher. You only have to submit to Spotify. You only have to submit to Apple Podcasts. If you put it in Apple Podcasts, it automatically gets into Overcast. It gets into Podcast Addict. It gets into Shifty Jelly Podcast. Google Podcasts there is no submit. They just scrape your website. So putting it into Apple Podcasts is key. It's the most important one. I always tell people, if you're not an Apple Podcast, you don't technically have a podcast. You need an RSS feed. You need to be an Apple Podcast. But if you're not an Apple Podcast, then you're not an Overcast. You're not in Shifty Jelly Podcast. You're not in Podcast Addict. You're not in about 30 or 40 other podcast aggregator apps that actually scrape from Apple Podcasts.
And that's huge. That would be missing out on a huge amount of audience base. I mean, for us, Apple Podcasts is well over 75% of our listeners come from Apple Podcasts and iTunes.
And that is normal. It is that disproportionate. When we say number 1 on our system is Apple Podcast, iTunes, we see it at overall globally about 63, 64%. Spotify at 7.2%. Overcast is number 3 at around 3%. So that's how that breakdown goes.
That's huge. That's huge. So let's talk about this, because I see a lot of people who kind of say to me that they're going to experiment with podcasting. And so what they tend to do is they'll get like a SoundCloud account, or they'll get an Anchor FM account or something like that. And then they'll run it from there. Now, when I started my podcast, I wasn't sure that I was A, going to be very good at podcasting, or B, whether it was going to be for me. So I didn't know where to kind of go. But again, luckily I had a really good podcast producer who said, no, you need to host on Libsyn. Like, that's the best way to set up a podcast. Even if you don't know whether you're going to continue with it, at least if you do, you know that it's all set up correctly from the beginning. So let's talk about like the difference between Libsyn and some of the other places that people might be experimenting when they start up a podcast.
Well, Allison, there are other good podcast hosts out there, but there are 3, I call them ASS to stay away from: Anchor, SoundCloud, Squarespace. Those are not where you want to actually host your podcasts, and for various reasons. Anchor, SoundCloud actually have no business models. And on Anchor, or their terms of service, any of their users can reuse any of their other users' content, re-edit it, remarket it. I won't actually be a guest on anybody that hosts on Anchor, because someone could take an interview I did, re-edit that interview per their terms of service, and make me sound like I said something that I didn't ever want to say.
Wow.
Yeah,
that's huge.
Yeah, so I say, stay away from them. There are others. If you don't want to go Libsyn, then there's Podbean and there's Blueberry and there's Fireside and there's others out there that you actually maintain control. And that's the important thing, is find a podcast host that's actually dedicated to podcasting. The issues with SoundCloud and Squarespace is they're not podcast hosting companies. SoundCloud has podcasting. Squarespace has podcasting, but that's not their core business. That's not what they focus on. So the tool set is very limited. And you don't want to limit yourself as a podcaster. If they don't have a way to directly submit your podcast into Spotify, which is the number 2 place, then you need to run away. Mm-hmm. They're not what you want for a service. It's a simple bellwether test.
And it's a really interesting one, because I think one of the things that I've been most excited about, and I mean, to be fair, I'm a complete numbers nerd, but one of the things that I get really excited about is that when I log into Libsyn, I can see how many people have listened to the podcast this month, where have they come from in terms of country, and location, where have they come from in terms of, are they an Apple listener, are they a Spotify listener, are they from somewhere else? And for me, being able to have that data has been invaluable in helping me grow it, because it's made me realize, okay, so actually, people are starting to listen to the podcast more on Spotify, because we have a lot of people are installing Spotify on smart TVs, which I did not realize, even though I have a smart TV. And people said to me, look, we'd love to listen to the podcast on Spotify because then I can listen to it on the TV while I'm doing the cleaning. Could you do that? And so we did, and having that data, being able to kind of look at it in a really granular way has meant that we're able to do so much more with the podcast, and we're able to make it so much more accessible to the people who want to listen to it and who enjoy it, and actually make it a much easier and more convenient listen for them as well, which I think has really helped us get more listeners.
Again, being everywhere, and Spotify is the number 2 place you got to be. And especially if your show is at all geared towards people between the ages of 18 and 30.
Mm-hmm.
We have some podcasts with us. Their biggest audience is Spotify. It's bigger than Apple Podcasts. So we have some shows, over 50% of their audience comes from Spotify. We've got quite a few that are over 25% of their audience comes from Spotify. So it depends on your genre. If your demographic for your audience is older males, 35 plus, and it's a tech show, probably not going to do so well on Spotify.
Mm-hmm.
But if your audience skews younger, 18 to 30, a little heavier on the female skew, then it has a chance to do really, really well on Spotify.
And it's these kinds of things that I think people don't necessarily think about when they start podcasting. I think people assume that their audience will be exactly the same podcasting as it is wherever else they are. So for example, when I went into podcasting, I already had an extensive email list. I had a Facebook community. We'd set up a blog and all that kind of stuff. But my podcast listeners are different. They like things to be convenient. They like easily consumable information. They like it to be actionable. And in that sense, they're actually much more vocal about what they want. And they're different to other people who perhaps consume other content of mine that isn't the podcast. And I think it's one of those things that people starting podcasts, one of my big regrets is that I didn't go on and listen to shows like yours where you talk about these stats, because actually if I'd have known half the stuff, since I've been binging on back episodes, if I'd have known half the stuff, it would have been so much easier to set up and be successful right from the get-go.
Yeah, and you mentioned an important point here. Your audience is more active and engaged. And I think one of the bigger mistakes a lot of podcasters make is not having a way for their audience to engage with them. The number of podcasts I've heard that don't have a call-in number, even if you don't plan to use the information, give them a call-in number. They're on a mobile device when they're listening to your show. It's a lot easier for them to call you to leave feedback than it is for them while they're driving down the road to type a feedback.
Mm-hmm.
But if there's a simple button where they can tap it on the phone and it calls you, and then they can leave you feedback, you have the feedback. Now, I highly recommend you use the feedback if they give you feedback and it's usable. Not everybody's feedback that they give you is usable. Some of those people give you the feedback with the convertible top down, and you really don't want to use it because of the audio quality so bad. Others will give you feedback that's just nonsensical ramblings, and you don't want to use it because it will kill your show. You have to be cognizant of your audience, the other members, and you don't always have to use it, but it's a good idea to use listener feedback where you can. Have an email address where they can also email you. So make it easy. Mention it multiple times on each episode that you have a way for them to get a hold of you. Getting your audience involved in your show, that's building community. They then tell their friends. Any person that becomes a guest via their voicemail on your show or an email you read on the show is likely to tell somebody that they were on your show.
Mm-hmm. And that's super, super powerful. So I love all of this. And obviously I'm the new massive advocate of podcasting for the right people, and for me, one of the kind of caveats that I've said certainly to people in my community is my top piece of advice would be you need to decide on what business model you want and what you really want your podcast to do for you. If you are somebody like John Lee Dumas or John Jansch and you are building a community around your podcast, it is, if it's going to be your main source of traffic, it's going to be your main source of lead generation, you need to focus on getting it right from the start. And you need to recognize that it's like any other platform. It's going to take time to build, and you need to put in some solid time, money, and energy into growing it consistently and into retaining your listenership and doing all those things. But equally, if you're somebody who already has a community, if you're somebody who already has an email list or a Facebook group, or you've been building a business for a few years and you're looking to find another way of nurturing your audience, then actually a podcast can be a really good option if you're somebody who, like me, is pretty lazy and you like batching content, you like engaging with people, you like answering questions and getting decent feedback from your audience, and you're prepared to give them a way to do that. Then actually because podcasting is, or because there are so many fewer podcasters than there are bloggers out there, it can be a really good way in the female entrepreneur space, certainly, to get yourself noticed and do something a bit different.
Yeah, 4,000 to 1 is roughly the number of female bloggers to female podcasters. So every 4,000 female bloggers, there's one female podcaster covering that topic.
Which is huge. Like, that is a huge, huge opportunity for market share, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I always say if you are a female blogger and you're not podcasting, you're not a very good marketer.
I love that. And I also think if the odds were the same, if we were talking about Tinder here, right? If everyone was like, oh yeah, there are 4,000 of the, kind of partner that I want and just one of me, everyone will be out on there. This is a huge, huge opportunity that people really are missing. And if it is for the sake of the fact that you perhaps don't like your voice, well, then don't listen to your recordings, don't make my mistake. If it's that the tech scares you, there are people out there who can help. There are podcast producers. There are people who can edit podcasts. Obviously, do your due diligence. Make sure you hire someone that's good. Don't hire someone that's crap, because that's not going to help you. But there are people who can help with that kind of thing. There are multiple podcasts out there that can teach you how to promote it in the best ways, how to make sure that you're leveraging audiences, how to provide the best experiences for people. So it shouldn't be something that puts you off if you are somebody who thinks, yeah, I want to get in people's earbuds.
Just start doing it. That's my best advice to folks, is just start it. Go with one episode, get going, get a couple under your belt, get some feedback from the people that you know, and then do a hard push. Do your hard push, all your marketing push at once. Wait till you get a couple episodes done so that you've actually been out and live and you've gotten some feedback from people that know, so that you can correct. I mean, I think that's the biggest mistake people make when they launch with 10 and they do the full promotion, is they launch with 10 episodes and they have no feedback. So they're launching with 10 bad episodes where they could have made simple corrections to make their episodes sound better.
And that's the interesting thing, with sales and with marketing, feedback is everything. If you don't understand why something isn't working and you're not asking for feedback, you're never going to be able to change it. You're never going to be able to solve the problem. So I think some of it does come down to having the sheer steel ovaries and saying, hey, why aren't you listening, or why aren't you opting in, or why aren't you doing the thing? Because then you'll find out why it's not working for your audience. And ultimately, that's information that you never want to assume.
In most cases, don't ask your mom for advice. She's not going to give you the constructive advice you need.
Yeah. I mean, my mum has just actually got her first ever tablet, her first ever iPad. And she is insistent that it doesn't work because she doesn't understand how to swipe from page to page. So definitely don't ask your mum if she's anything like mine for any kind of technical advice. Amazing. So thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate this. It's one of those things that I think everyone should be considering podcasting as an option, and obviously making sure they're thinking about whether or not it genuinely is the right fit for their business. But please pimp you to us. Tell us where we can find you, and tell us what people should be coming to you and following you for content-wise and obviously Libsyn wise.
Right. Well, if you have any questions, you can always reach out to me directly. Rob, R-O-B as in Robert, R-O-B at Libsyn, L-I-B-S-Y-N, which stands for Liberated Syndication. So rob at Libsyn.com. Or you can find our podcast, The Feed, that I do at LC Escobar. And you can find that at thefeed.libsyn.com. Or you can just search for The Feed and then Libsyn in any podcast directory that you use. And our podcast tells people about podcasting, what's going on. We talk about stats and we give you the latest news and advice and how to market and how not to market. We go over how people are getting kicked out of iTunes this week, things like that, because Apple is clearing out the spammers. So if you are a podcaster already and you have lots of keywords in your title of your show, you may want to listen to our most recent episodes. Talk about podcasts getting kicked out because Apple is bringing down the ban hammer on folks.
I love it. And I've been binge listening to these previous episodes and they are phenomenal. I've learned an awful lot over the last, I think it was 2 weeks since we last spoke. And I've just been sat here listening for the last 2 weeks thinking, oh God, there is so much other stuff that I could be doing.
And we try to make it a fun show. So it's not just Uber tech.
No.
It's not just boring podcast. Oh, put this tag in your RSS feed and you'll be good to go. Not all that.
Well, that's always a good start. So if you are somebody who is thinking about listening to a decent podcast on how to go and set up your own podcast, please make sure you go and check it out. It is honestly incredible. I have been binge listening, and I'm very now excited to go and listen to this episode about the banhammer, because you've kind of terrified me and excited me simultaneously there, if I admit.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of shows get kicked out of iTunes we're recording here near the end of September. So the last month, since really middle of August 2018 to the end of September, we've seen a bunch of shows get kicked out because of keyword spamming the title and the author tags in iTunes.
Wow, that's huge. Well, there you go, guys. If you have any questions about podcasting, please make sure that you reach out to Rob. Please make sure that you go ahead and listen to the feed, especially if you're somebody who's thinking about setting up a podcast, or if you've currently got a podcast that isn't performing in the same way that you'd like. We also have been lucky enough to be selected as an affiliate for Libsyn, yay, which makes me very happy. So if you are somebody who is currently hosting a podcast and you want to move across to Libsyn, or you are thinking about setting up a podcast and you want to set it up right from the get-go and get it onto the right hosting platform, and you want to choose Libsyn, which obviously I would highly recommend because they're amazing, then check out the show notes. We have a special promo code that you can use to go ahead and grab yourself a Libsyn account and a month for free, which I think is an insane free trial, by the way.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you for, and thank you for hosting your podcast with Libsyn. We appreciate that. And, we're here to help podcasters promote their brand. I think that's one of the things that's core amongst Libsyn is we want you guys and girls to get your branding out there. And we try to get out of the way and let you do it all about you. And that's why most people don't even know the podcast that hosts with us, even though we're the biggest podcast host out there.
And that's the thing, I have found that Libsyn have been super, super supportive of how we've set up the podcast over the last year. There's never been a time like when we've reached out, and I've asked some really stupid questions over the last year, but everybody has been so helpful, and people genuinely just want your podcast to be good. And I think that's one of the best things about hosting with Libsyn is that there's so much information there. It's really easy to access, but actually you have this kind of team feel with the support team and everybody behind it that makes you think, yeah, they just want me to have the best podcast that I can. And that's really cool.
Hopefully a few of your listeners will become podcasters, if not with us, with others, but hopefully with us, and really try it out. It really will. I really do see it making difference in people's lives because it really does differentiate you from the bloggers that are out there.
100%. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day. I massively, massively appreciate it. And guys, if you've enjoyed this episode, please make sure that you go over, that you make sure to subscribe to Rob's podcast, The Feed, and obviously leave us a little review on iTunes and let us know how we did, because, even though they're not as important as they used to be, they're still important, and I still like to know how we're getting on. We'll see you in the next episode. Have an amazing weekend.